War, as it turned out, made for terrible parenting advice, though nobody had bothered mentioning this to the Krees in the 17 sectors of civilized space. Certain truths held themselves to be self-evident. Gravity pulled things down unless you were in space, where down became a matter of perspective and philosophical debate. Energy could neither be created nor destroyed, though accountants throughout the galaxy had made careers attempting otherwise. And if you wanted a species to survive the meat grinder of interstellar politics, you bred your children hard. The Kraves understood this better than most. Their home world of Cathera Prime orbited a binary star system, which meant their ancestors had evolved under skies that never truly darkened, always watching, always vigilant. Perhaps this explained their cultural obsession with readiness, or perhaps they were simply paranoid as a baseline condition. Either way, the result was the same: a civilization that treated childhood the way other species treated boot camp. From the moment a Kravish cub drew its first breath, its life became a carefully orchestrated symphony of strategic development. No lullabibis here, just tactical briefings set to a pleasant rhythm. Their nurseries resembled command centers, complete with holographic star maps that doubled as mobiles. By the time most species were learning to walk, Kraves cubs were learning to flank. The proving grounds of Cathara stood as testament to this philosophy, a sprawling complex of reinforced alloy and simulated battlefields that stretched across the northern continent. Towers jutted skyward like steel fangs, between which training arenas flickered with hard light projections of every conceivable combat scenario. Inside these walls, cubs as young as 4 solar cycles ran tactical drills. By 6 cycles, they could field strip a plasma rifle. By 8, they were running squad-level operations that would make seasoned soldiers weep with either pride or existential dread. Commander Veith stood on the observation deck, his forearms crossed in a configuration that suggested both authority and a certain weariness with existence. Below, a cohort of 9 cycle cubs executed a pincer movement against simulated Zelthari raiders. The cubs moved with practiced precision, their smaller frames darting between cover, laying suppressive fire, executing the maneuver exactly as doctrine demanded. Perfect, flawless, completely by the book. And therein, though Veith would never admit it aloud, lay a problem he couldn't quite articulate. The Zelthari situation had taught the Kravish several important lessons. First, that the Zelthari were significantly better at void combat than anyone had anticipated. Second, that overconfidence remained the most efficient path to casualties. And third, perhaps most troubling, that the Kravish military doctrine that had served them for 3,000 years was beginning to show certain inflexibilities. Young Kravish warriors fought brilliantly, courageously, and with textbook precision. They also died at rates that were becoming statistically uncomfortable, not catastrophic. Mind you, the Kravish were still winning their conflicts, maintaining their territorial integrity and projecting force with admirable efficiency, but the mortality curves had shifted just enough to trigger alarm bells in the minds of military analysts who spent their days staring at data streams until their eyes crossed. The cubs below completed their exercise. Tactical victory achieved. 0 casualties. Mission parameters exceeded. They assembled in formation awaiting critique with the stillness of trained soldiers 3 times their age. This should have filled Vith with pride. Instead, he felt something uncomfortably adjacent to unease. The door behind him whispered open. Strategist Imran entered, her scales carrying the darker chromatic patterns that denoted senior military caste. She moved to stand beside Vith, observing the cubs below with an expression that suggested she was running calculations in her head. Human cultural liaison arrived this morning, Makran said, her tone carefully neutral in that way that indicated she had opinions she was diplomatically suppressing. Vith's spines rippled with something between curiosity and apprehension. The one from the exchange program. Indeed, humanity has requested permission to observe our youth development protocols. In exchange, they have offered to share their own educational methodologies. How generous, Vith's sarcasm could have corroded hull plating. The species that stumbled into galactic society barely 2 centuries ago wishes to teach us about raising warriors. The Krees have been perfecting combat training since before their star system had a name in the common databases. The request comes with High Council approval, Mr. reminded him, which was diplomatic speak for this is happening whether you like it or not. So adjust your attitude accordingly. Vith uncrossed 2 of his 4 arms, then recrossed them in a different configuration that better expressed his resignation. When does this human observer begin? Tomorrow, dawn cycle. Wonderful, I shall prepare the cubs for inspection by a species whose most notable military achievement is not accidentally shooting themselves with their own weapons. Vith paused. Most of the times, facial plates shifted into something that might have been amusement. The High Council believes fresh perspectives may prove valuable. The human military record, while short, has proven surprisingly effective. They have won conflicts against forces that should have obliterated them through simple mathematical superiority. Luck, Vakith countered, and a disturbing willingness to ignore reasonable tactical doctrine in favor of improvisation. Perhaps there exists something in their approach worth examining. Vith watched the cubs below disperse to their barracks, their movements still precise, still controlled, still exactly what the training demanded. They are cubs, Imran, malleable, impressionable. If this human attempts to fill their heads with soft philosophies about cooperation and understanding, we may compromise an entire generation. The High Council considered this risk and decided the potential benefits outweighed the dangers of exposing our youth to a species that thinks warfare is something you can solve with cleverness and audacity rather than proper preparation. The decision has been made, Commander. Which was? Vith reflected the problem. With democracy and consensus building, someone was always making decisions that affected your domain, and you simply had to endure it with whatever grace you could manufacture. Below, the training grounds reset themselves, hard light projections dissolving and reforming into new configurations. Another cohort would arrive shortly, and the cycle would continue. Cubs learning to fight, to strategize, to survive in a galaxy that made no promises about fairness or mercy. And tomorrow a human would arrive to observe this process with whatever strange notions their species had developed about childhood and education. Veth tried to imagine what a human youth development program might look like. probably involved excessive emotional validation and group activities designed to build self-esteem rather than combat capabilities. Humans were notorious for their attachment to abstract concepts like happiness and personal fulfillment, as if these things mattered more than survival. The human has requested minimal accommodations, match and added standard quarters, access to training, observation areas, and permission to interact with cubs during non-combat instruction periods. Interact with them. Veth's spines flatten against his skull. A defensive posture. This human plans to teach our cubs, observe and suggest. According to the agreement, nothing mandatory, simply offering alternative perspectives on educational methodology. Made a sound that didn't translate well into any language but conveyed profound skepticism. I will ensure security. Protocols are observed if this human attempts to compromise our training standards. The experiment ends. Immediately understood. Departed, leaving Veth alone with his thoughts and the view of empty training in grounds, preparing for the next wave of cubs. Somewhere in those barracks, young Craves were reviewing tactical data, analyzing their performance, identifying areas for improvement. They did this because it was expected, because it was necessary, because this was how things had always been done, and tomorrow a human would arrive to question everything. Veth told himself. He was prepared for this. He commanded training facilities that had produced some of the finest warriors in Craves history. One human observer, no matter how peculiar their species, could not possibly disrupt centuries of refined doctrine. He believed this right up until the moment he met the human and realized that every assumption he had made was catastrophically insufficient. But that would be tomorrow's problem. Tonight the cubs slept in their barracks, dreaming whatever dreams young warriors dreamed, probably involving flanking maneuvers and optimal firing solutions. Their futures stretched ahead of them, predetermined paths toward military service and the continuation of Cravish strength. The binary sun set over Cathera Prime, casting double shadows across the proving grounds, and somewhere in the diplomatic quarter, human unpacked their belongings and prepared to introduce chaos into the most regimented society in the known galaxy. Nobody was ready for what came next, especially not the cubs. The human arrived at dawn cycle carrying a single bag and wearing what could only be described as aggressively casual clothing. No formal diplomatic robes, no military dress uniform, not even business attire that suggested taking the occasion seriously. Just simple pants, a shirt with some incomprehensible text across the chest, and footwear that appeared designed for comfort rather than making an impression. Veth stared at this creature and felt his expectations crumbling in real time. Humans stood shorter than Crabfish by nearly half a meter, built with that bilateral symmetry that always looked slightly unbalanced to species with proper four-armed configurations. This particular specimen had dark skin, close-cropped hair going silver at the temples, and eyes that seemed to catalog everything while simultaneously appearing completely relaxed about it. The juxtaposition was unsettling. Commander Vaketh. The human extended one hand, palm empty, in that bizarre greeting ritual their species insisted upon. I appreciate you hosting me. Facilities here are impressive. Veth clasped the offered hand briefly, careful not to crush the fragile Appendage, humans were remarkably breakable for a species that kept picking fights above their weight class. Welcome to the proving grounds, I trust. Your accommodations are sufficient. More than sufficient, I've stayed in worse places, military barracks on 3 different continents actually, but that's a long story involving poor diplomatic planning and one very confused transport coordinator. The human smiled, which involved showing teeth in a manner that most species would interpret as a threat display, but humans somehow meant as friendliness. Should we begin the facility tour? Thus began what Vaketh would later describe in private and heavily encrypted communications as the most bewildering day of his military career. The human observed everything with polite interest that bordered on enthusiasm, watched Cubs disassemble and reassemble plasma rifles with nodding approval, examined tactical simulation equipment with genuine curiosity, asked questions that demonstrated surprising knowledge of military theory while simultaneously revealing assumptions that made Veth's scales itch. How old are they? The human asked, watching a cohort of cubs execute combat roles across an obstacle course, 7 cycles, and they're already handling live weapons training, simulated plasma rifles, live ammunition. Training begins at 9 cycles once grip, strength and reaction times reach appropriate parameters. The human made a non-committal sound that could have meant anything from agreement to profound disturbance. What about recreational time? Recreation is incorporated into training exercises, physical fitness activities, team building through tactical scenarios, strategic games that reinforce decision-making skills. Right, but I mean unstructured play, downtime time, when they're not being evaluated or developed or trained. Veth's facial plates arrange themselves into confusion. Unstructured time would be inefficient. Every moment represents an opportunity for growth and skill development. Fascinating. The human pulled out a small data pad and made notes and socialization outside their combat units. Cubs are assigned to cohorts at age 4 cycles. These units become their operational families. Strong bonds enhance tactical coordination and mutual trust under combat conditions, so they don't interact with cubs outside their assigned groups. Cross-cohort integration occurs during large-scale training exercises. Competition between units fosters excellence. More note-taking. The human's expression remained carefully neutral, which somehow felt more judgmental than open criticism would have been. They observed advanced hand-to-hand combat training. Cubs 11 cycles old sparred with controlled aggression, their movements displaying years of refinement. Strikes landed with precision. Defensive maneuvers flowed automatically, and every engagement demonstrated textbook application of Kree martial doctrine. They're very skilled, the human commented. They are adequate for their age bracket. The truly exceptional students advance to accelerated programs. Who determines what qualifies as exceptional? Performance metrics, combat simulation scores, tactical analysis evaluations, physical capability assessments, psychological stress resistance testing. What about creativity, problem-solving outside established parameters, lateral thinking? Veth's spines flatten slightly. Creativity that deviates from proven doctrine typically results in casualties. We train our cubs to execute Optimal strategies, not experiment with untested theories and situation. Lives depend on reliable outcomes. The human absorbed this with another of those neutral expressions that felt loaded with unspoken commentary. Would it be possible to interact directly with some of the cubs? Nothing formal, just conversation. Every instinct Veith possessed screamed warnings about allowing an outsider unsupervised access to impressionable youth, but the High Council had authorized this exchange, and refusing would reflect poorly on both his command and cravish commitment to diplomatic agreements. Supervised interaction can be arranged during their midday meal period. Perfect. I appreciate your flexibility, Commander. The meal hall operated with the same regimented efficiency that characterized every aspect of the proving grounds. Cubs entered in cohorts, collected nutritionally balanced rations from automated dispensers, consumed their food in designated time frames, and departed for afternoon training sessions. Conversation occurred, but quietly, without the chaos that supposedly characterized young beings and other species. The humans sat at a table with one cohort of 8-cycle-old cubs, 5 individuals who regarded this strain alien with expressions ranging from curiosity to suspicion. Veth observed from a respectful distance, close enough to intervene if necessary, but far enough to avoid obviously hovering. So the human began conversationally. What do you all do for fun? The cubs exchanged glances, a silent communication perfected through cycles of joint training. Finally, one spoke. We train. Training is purposeful, sure. But what about when you're not training? What do you enjoy? Another pause. Recreation period involves physical conditioning and strategic games, right? But what do you like doing? What makes you happy? The cubs looked genuinely confused by this question, as if the human had asked them to explain a concept that existed only in theoretical mathematics. One cub, slightly larger than they others, ventured an answer. Scoring well on tactical evaluations is satisfying. Improving our cohort rankings is desirable. The human's expression shifted into something Veith couldn't quite parse. Not judgment exactly, but perhaps something adjacent to sadness, which made no sense whatsoever. These cubs were healthy, well-trained, excelling in their development. What possible reason existed for sadness? Have any of you ever just played, made up games, built things just to see what happens? Blank stares answered this question. Okay, different approach. If you could do anything tomorrow, no training, no evaluations, just whatever you wanted, what would it be? The cubs considered this bizarre hypothetical with the seriousness they applied to tactical problems. Eventually answers emerged. Review combat footage to analyze techniques, practice advanced weapons handling, study historical battles. The human rubbed their face with one hand, a gesture that among humans apparently indicated stress or frustration. What if I told you that some of the best soldiers I've ever known spent their childhoods climbing trees, building forts, making up elaborate games, and generally getting into low-stakes trouble? Now the cubs looked at the human like they were describing alien biology from a fever dream. Warriors who don't understand play. The human continued, speaking more to themselves than the cubs often struggle to understand why they're fighting. You can teach someone to win battles, but if they don't know what peace feels like, what exactly are they protecting? This Statement landed on the table like a tactical grenade minus the explosion. The Cubs processed it with visible confusion, their training providing no framework for understanding what this human was suggesting. Veith had heard enough. He approached the table with deliberate steps. Cubs, return to your afternoon training assignments. They departed with military precision, leaving the human sitting alone, looking thoughtful in a way that made Veith's combat instincts activate. Your philosophical observations are noted, Veith said carefully. However, I would ask that you avoid introducing concepts that might undermine established training protocols. The human looked up at him with those unsettling eyes that seemed older than the face surrounding them. Commander, I'm not here to undermine anything. I'm here because your High Council asked for a different perspective, but I need you to understand something, which is you're raising soldiers. That's fine. Humanity raises soldiers too, but we learned something important after a few thousand years of warfare. The human stood, meeting Veith's gaze. Despite the height difference, the best warriors aren't the ones who only know how to fight. They're the ones who understand what they're fighting for, and you can't understand peace if you've never experienced it. Our Cubs experience peace. They live in a peaceful facility, receive excellent care, are protected from actual danger. They live in a weapons factory that looks like a school. There's a difference. The human shouldered their bag. Look, I know this sounds like soft thinking from a species you probably consider militarily juvenile, but humor me for a few days. Let me try something with one cohort. If it compromises their performance metrics, I'll leave, and you can report to the High Council that human educational methods are incompatible with Crave's development. Every rational thought Veith possessed urged him to refuse, but something in the human's tone, a quiet confidence, that suggested this wasn't theoretical pontification but hard-earned experience, gave him pause. What exactly are you proposing? Give me one cohort for 1 week. I won't stop their regular training, but let me supplement it with activities you'll probably consider pointless. If at the end of that week their performance has declined, I'll concede failure, but if their performance improves or even just stays level, maybe we can discuss what peacetime development offers that pure combat training doesn't. Strategist Imran would support this. Veith knew the High Council would view it as fulfilling the cultural exchange mandate, and if it failed, as Veith suspected it would, at least they would have documentation proving that human methods didn't translate to Cravish physiology or psychology. One cohort, 1 week. Their regular training continues unchanged. You may supplement with your activities during recreation periods only. The human smiled again, that teeth showing expression that probably meant satisfaction. Thank you, Commander. I promise you this will be educational. That Veith reflected as the human departed was precisely what worried him. By evening cycle, word had spread through the facility that the human observer was conducting an experiment with cohort Theta 7. Speculation ran rampant among the instructors. Some viewed it as amusing, others as concerning, most as simply puzzling. Veith retreated to his command office and filed a detailed report documenting the day's events. He included his observations about the humans' unusual questions and concerning philosophical statements. He noted for the record that He maintained reservations about this approach but was proceeding in accordance with High Council directives. Then he sat back and wondered what exactly the human meant by teaching peace to cubs who had been born into a civilization perpetually prepared for war. The answer, he suspected, would prove either revolutionary or disastrous, with distressingly little middle ground between those outcomes. Day one of the experiment began with confusion weaponized as pedagogy. The human arrived at recreation period, carrying supplies that made absolutely no tactical sense: colored materials, adhesive compounds, structural components that served no military function. Today the human announced to Cohort Theta 7, "We're building whatever you want. No rules, no objectives, no performance metrics. Just create something." The 5 cubs stared at this incomprehensible directive with the bewilderment of soldiers ordered to advance in no particular direction. What tactical purpose does this construction serve? None whatsoever. That's the point. If confusion had mass, the silence that followed would have achieved gravitational collapse. Eventually, instinct overrode confusion. The cubs began assembling materials, initially attempting to create recognizable military structures. Then something shifted. One cub, smaller than the others, began constructing something that resembled no tactical structure in any database: a tower that spiraled upward with no defensive purpose, decorated with colored materials, arranged in patterns that served purely aesthetic functions. "What are you making?" the larger cub asked. "I don't know yet, but it looks interesting." The human smiled and said nothing. By day 3, Cohort Theta 7's recreation periods had transformed into something Veith couldn't categorize. The cubs laughed. They invented games with rules that changed based on collective whim. They built increasingly elaborate structures that served no purpose beyond the joy of construction, and somehow, impossibly, their combat performance metrics improved. Veith reviewed the data repeatedly, certain he was misinterpreting results, but the numbers remained consistent. Tactical creativity scores increased by 12%. Adaptive problem solving during combat simulations jumped 17%. Unit cohesion metrics climbed to levels rarely achieved outside of combat. Veteran squads. Strategist Imran examined the same data with an expression that suggested reality had become negotiable. This makes no logical sense, and yet Veith gestured at the reports. By day 5, other cohorts had noticed something different about Theta 7. They still trained with characteristic discipline, but something in their approach had shifted. They experimented more during tactical exercises, trying unconventional solutions during a routine combat simulation against standard Zelthari Raider tactics. Cohort Theta 7 executed a maneuver that appeared in no Kree tactical database. Instead of standard defensive counterattack protocols, they feigned retreat, drew the enemy into overextension, then collapsed on the flanks from unexpected angles while broadcasting false communications. The simulation declared Theta 7 victorious in 63% of the time. Standard doctrine required with 0 casualties versus the usual acceptable loss projections. Veith walked to the humans' quarters and knocked with perhaps more force than diplomatic courtesy required. The human opened the door looking unsurprised. "Commander, I assume you saw the Simulation results, what are you doing? To those cubs, teaching them that warfare isn't just about following the best pre-existing solution. Sometimes it's about creating new solutions. Nobody's tried yet, and you can't create new solutions if you've never exercised creativity in low-stakes environments. You're teaching them to play that improves their combat effectiveness. I'm teaching them that thinking and fighting aren't separate activities. That imagination isn't the opposite of discipline, it's a different kind of tool. Veith stood in the door, watching this small human who had somehow in 5 days accomplished what centuries of refined Kravish doctrine had never considered attempting. The week isn't over, we will observe the remaining days before drawing conclusions. Fair enough, but Commander, you might want to start thinking about how you'll explain this to the High Council, because I don't think we can unteach cubs what they've learned about imagination. The cubs had learned to play, and somehow it had made them better warriors. Week's end arrived with Cohort Theta 7 performing 28% above baseline across all combat metrics. The data couldn't be disputed, explained away, or ignored. The High Council convened an emergency session. Veith presented his findings with the enthusiasm of someone reporting their own obsolescence. Strategist Imran provided supporting analysis. The human sat quietly in the observation section, looking like someone who had proven a point they'd rather not have needed to make. These cubs who played, one council member said, slowly outperform cubs trained exclusively in warfare, consistently and significantly. Vakith confirmed. How is this possible? The human spoke from the observation section, voice carrying across the chamber. Because peace isn't the absence of war, it's what gives war meaning. Soldiers who understand joy fight harder to protect it. Warriors who know creativity solve problems. Doctrine can't anticipate. Cubs who learn to build understand better what they're defending. Silence filled the council chamber with the weight of civilizational reconsideration. You're suggesting, another council member ventured, that our entire youth development philosophy is fundamentally flawed. Not flawed, incomplete. The human stood. You've spent millennia teaching cubs how to destroy. Maybe it's time you taught them what's worth protecting. The council adjourned without formal decision, which itself constituted a decision of sorts. Within a month, recreation protocols across all Krave's youth facilities underwent revision. Unstructured play became mandatory. Creativity exercises supplemented tactical training. Cubs learned to imagine before they learned to fight. Performance metrics climbed across the board. Veith watched Cohort Theta 7 graduate to advanced training. Their unconventional thinking now setting standards rather than raising concerns. The human had departed weeks earlier. Cultural exchange completed, leaving behind a civilization questioning 3,000 years of assumptions. Warriors born in war taught peace by species barely 2 centuries into galactic society. The irony was sharp enough to cut through reinforced hull plating. Somewhere in the training grounds, cubs laughed while building towers that served no tactical purpose, and their combat scores reached heights previous generations never achieved. Turns out, war made terrible parenting advice. Peace apparently made better soldiers.